While selling books at a loss, Jeff Bezos was secretly building something bigger than Amazon itself. In the late 1990s, Amazon.com was, on paper, a terrible business. It sold books, then CDs, then almost everything else, on margins so thin they barely existed. Every dollar of revenue came with a few cents of profit attached, if it came with any profit at all. Analysts joked that Amazon was Amazon.org, the charity that happened to ship packages. And yet, somewhere inside that unprofitable bookstore, a different company was quietly being born. Not a store, not a warehouse. A piece of infrastructure so unglamorous that almost nobody outside the building understood what it was for. Nobody asked for it. Bezos built it anyway. This is the story of how a company that sold paperbacks at a loss ended up owning the servers that run half the internet, and how a decision that made no sense in 2002 became the reason Amazon exists today. Amazon began in a garage in Bellevue, Washington, in 1994, with desks built out of wooden doors to save money. Bezos wasn't trying to build an empire, he was trying to prove a narrow, almost boring thesis, that people would buy things over the internet if the selection was big enough and the price was fair enough. Books were the test case, millions of titles, easy to ship, no need to touch or try before buying. It worked, revenue climbed fast. But underneath the growth was a company assembled out of duct tape, servers bought piecemeal, software patched together department by department, engineers spending more time untangling their own systems than building new ones. By the early 2000s, Amazon had survived the dot-com crash that killed most of its peers. Companies with flashier launches and bigger funding rounds. Survival wasn't a triumph, it was a warning. The internet business, even for the company that made it through, was still fragile. Still thin-margined, still one bad quarter away from serious trouble. Inside Amazon's engineering teams, a different problem kept surfacing. Every time a new feature launched, search recommendations, checkout engineers had to rebuild the same underlying pieces from scratch. Storage, computing power, databases. There was no shared foundation. Teams were reinventing the wheel every few months, and it was slowing the entire company down. A small group of engineers proposed something radical: standardize the infrastructure, build internal tools so clean and reliable that any team at Amazon could plug into them like a utility. The way a factory plugs into the power grid instead of building its own generator. It was meant to solve an internal headache. Nobody in that room was thinking about renting servers to strangers, but once the internal version worked, the question became unavoidable: if this infrastructure was good enough for Amazon's own engineers, why not sell access to it? That question is where the empire actually begins. The idea landed badly. Amazon's own retail leadership pushed back. Why was engineering time being spent on server infrastructure instead of the website that actually made money? The company was still recovering from the dot-com crash, still watching every dollar, diverting capital toward data centers. For a product with no confirmed customers, looked reckless. Wall Street, when word got out, was blunter. A bookstore, building server farms. Analysts questioned whether Amazon's leadership understood what business it was actually in. The stock had already been punished once for years of losses. This looked like another reason to punish it again. Inside the company, the friction was just as sharp. Selling spare computing capacity meant potentially helping competitors, other retailers, even rivals run their own websites faster and cheaper. Some executives argued Amazon would be arming the very companies trying to put it out of business. There was no confirmed demand. No customer had asked for rentable computing power, the way customers had asked for cheaper books. It was a bet on a need that didn't exist yet, made by a company that couldn't really afford to lose the bet. Bezos had a habit that unsettled people who worked for him. He was comfortable being misunderstood for years, as long as he believed the underlying logic was sound. He didn't need the market to agree with him in the moment. He needed to be right eventually. And he was willing to wait for that. Internally, he pushed the AWS team with a simple, almost stubborn question: what would customers want, even if they didn't know how to ask for it yet? Nobody was requesting rentable computing power the way they requested lower shipping costs or better search results. But Bezos treated that silence as an opportunity, not a warning sign. If a need was real but unspoken, whoever built the answer first wouldn't just capture a market, they'd define one. He set brutal internal standards anyway. The infrastructure had to be reliable enough that outside companies could build their entire businesses on top of it without fear. Not good enough for Amazon, good enough for strangers betting their own survival on it. That bar was higher than anything the retail side of the business had ever been held to. Some of his own executives thought the timing was wrong, that Amazon should fix its own house before renting out the foundation. Bezos's response became something close to a company mantra in a fast-changing industry. The risk isn't moving too early, it's being certain, and being wrong, and finding out too late to fix it. The store was the distraction, the servers were the empire. In 2002, Amazon quietly opened the first version of these services to outside developers. In 2006, it formalized the offering under a new name, Amazon Web Services, Storage, Computing Power. Databases are sold not to shoppers, but to other businesses, priced by the hour, with no long-term contracts required. This was the irreversible decision. Amazon wasn't just building tools for itself anymore. It was reorganizing part of the company around the idea that computing infrastructure itself, not books, not products, could be the thing it sold. It meant treating a retail company's internal plumbing as a product in its own right, and betting real capital on customers who, at the time, barely existed. He wasn't selling books. He was selling the future. Early customers were small, startups without the money to buy their own servers, developers experimenting with new ideas. Oz let them rent computing power the way a household rents electricity. Pay for what you use, scale up or down instantly. No factory-sized investment required. It was invisible to the average Amazon shopper. Nobody buying a book that year noticed anything had changed. What began as a side project for cash-strapped startups became the backbone for something much bigger. Companies that didn't want to build and maintain their own data centers found an AWS a way to launch fast and scale without massive upfront cost, streaming services, photo-sharing apps, and eventually entire industries began renting their infrastructure from Amazon instead of owning it. The efficiency Amazon had originally built to fix its own engineering bottlenecks turned out to be valuable to almost anyone running anything online. Oz grew quietly at first, then rapidly expanding into new regions, new services, new customers who had never bought a single product from Amazon.com and never would. They weren't Amazon's shoppers, they were Amazon's tenants. By the time competitors noticed what had happened, Amazon had years of a head start, not in retail, but in an entirely different business it had backed into almost by accident. For years, Amazon didn't just have a head start in cloud computing, it had the field almost entirely to itself. Microsoft didn't launch its own serious competitor, Azure, until 2010. Nearly a decade after Amazon had begun renting out server space to outside developers, Google's cloud offering arrived even later in a comparable form. By the time either company took the market seriously, Oz wasn't an experiment anymore. It was already running the infrastructure behind thousands of businesses that had grown up entirely inside Amazon's servers, with no easy way to migrate elsewhere without rebuilding everything from scratch. That head start became one of Amazon's most valuable assets, not a product, not a patent, but time. Every year competitors spent deciding whether cloud computing was worth taking seriously was another year Amazon spent improving a service its rivals hadn't started building yet. When Microsoft and Google finally committed real resources, they weren't just late, they were chasing a company that had already learned, through years of paying customers, what worked and what didn't. Amazon's mistakes had already happened, quietly, years earlier, and it had already fixed them. For years, Oz operated with thin visibility into its own profitability, folded into Amazon's overall results. Still treated by much of Wall Street as a side experiment attached to a struggling retailer. Retail margins stayed brutally low. For years, Oz operated with thin visibility into its own profitability, folded into Amazon's overall results. Still treated by much of Wall Street as a side experiment attached to a struggling retailer. Retail margins stayed brutally low. Amazon kept reinvesting nearly everything it earned, and the stock price reflected the market's patience running thin. The critics called Bezos' strategy unfocused, questioned why the everything store was pouring money into server farms instead of its core business. The reinvention came when Amazon finally broke out AWS's numbers separately. What had looked like an unprofitable distraction turned out to be carrying a disproportionate share of the company's actual profit. The business built on infrastructure generating far higher margins than the retail operation that had funded its birth. The store was the distraction, the servers were the empire. The company that investors thought they understood, the thin margin online retailer, had, without most of them noticing, become something else, a cloud computing company that happened to also sell products. Today, Amazon Web Services powers a striking share of the internet most people use every day, streaming platforms, banks, government agencies, startups nobody has heard of yet. None of them are Amazon customers in the way that matters to most people. They're renting the infrastructure of a company that started by selling books at a loss. Nobody asked for it. Bezos built it anyway. The lesson isn't really about servers. It's about what happens when a company solves its own internal problems so well that the solution becomes more valuable than the problem it was meant to fix. Amazon didn't set out to build the invisible backbone of the internet. It set out to sell books without losing its mind over infrastructure, and ended up owning the infrastructure everyone else needed to. He wasn't selling books. He was selling the future. If you've ever wondered what's actually running underneath the apps and websites you use every day, there's a good chance the answer traces back to a decision nobody outside one company thought made why sense until it quietly became the reason that company still exists. If this story surprised you, subscribe at Built from Zero uncovers the decisions behind the empires you already know.